Neil deGrasse Tyson's slow motion decline is the perfect metaphor for just how far the woke mind virus has spread. Here's a guy who once made science cool, who could break down the cosmos in ways that made everyone feel a little smarter, but now he's out here twisting objective facts into ideological origami, desperately trying to please the very people who've turned science into a choose-your-own-adventure novel. Tyson's fall isn't just sad, it's a symptom of a culture that swapped critical thinking for critical theory and demands blind faith in narratives that fall apart under the weight of their own contradictions. And today's clips make it painfully clear. Tyson, once a champion of follow the evidence, now fumbles through half-baked defenses of the indefensible. Whether he's pretending the science behind biological differences in sports is complicated or pitching hormone-based leagues like some rejected Star Trek subplot, the result is the same. The woke virus spares no one. Not even America's favorite astrophysicist. Tyson has become a prime example of what happens when ideology steamrolls reality. The man who used to explain gravity now is doing the equivalent of believing it doesn't exist. Let's break down this mess clip by clip, starting with his most recent appearance on Piers Morgan.
And what it said to me was, yeah, America is a fast food country. I mean, it just is. So is there anything intrinsically wrong in principle with a bit of a disruptor like RFK going, you know what, we're just going to attack all this. We're going to try and make America a healthier place, even if, albeit, he has some pretty out there views about things like vaccine.
I have to see the details. I don't know where he will land in these things. Yeah, there are things he said previously, but not everything he said even agreed with itself.
Right.
So it's hard to predict where that's going to land when he takes office. But I can tell you that in the end, nature is the ultimate judge, jury, and executioner of what is objectively true in this world. And so you cannot rise to power, declare something that is true that has no scientific support. You can get away with it for a little while because you can drum up support, especially on social media, but that you're building a house of cards that will ultimately collapse. Or if you manage to shore up the house of cards with more things that are not objectively true, other countries will rise up and they will lead the world in ways that we once did. And I've come to realize that we are highly reactive rather than proactive as a country relative to our place in the rest of the world. And I fear that we may have to sink a little lower in our sort of scientific prowess before everyone wakes up and realizes we're not on the right track, yet other countries are.
Okay.
And because you and I, we're same age-ish, we lived the second half of the 20th century with the United States leading in practically every metric in science and technology.
Yeah.
And I just got very accustomed to that, frankly. Yeah, and I'd like to see that continue.
Tyson's performance here deserves the same level of scrutiny he claims to apply to objective truth. The problem? He provides none. Tyson says, there are things RFK has said previously, but not everything he said even agreed with itself. Really, Neil? That's your big analysis? That's not a rebuttal. That's a vague hand wave worthy of a politician trying to dodge a debate question. Which things exactly don't agree? What claims are scientifically false? If you're going to posture as a bastion of reason, you should at least bring some specifics to the table. But instead, Neil shuffles through ambiguity like he's afraid to upset someone. Likely because he already got pushback the last time he ridiculed RFK for daring to suggest Americans look beyond fast food and pasteurized milk. You know, those wild ideas like healthier eating and independent alternatives. Concepts that, ironically, science has consistently supported. It's almost as though Neil didn't enjoy being questioned by a public who's growing increasingly tired of empty rhetoric. So now, instead of his earlier enthusiasm to take RFK down, we see him hedging his bets. He sounds critical, but says nothing definitive. Why? Speculatively, perhaps he's trying to maintain his adversarial stance without admitting he was wrong, attempting to thread the needle between critique and cowardice. But what he does instead is pivot into fear-mongering. Tyson warns that America will lose its place in the world if we stray too far from objective truths. Again, vague. How, Neil? Are we to believe that raw milk and alternatives to Big Macs are the cracks in America's foundation? Of course not. What Tyson fails to acknowledge is that America's success, its technological and cultural dominance, wasn't built on conformity to government-endorsed doctrines. It was built on freedom. Freedom of expression, freedom of enterprise, the very spirit of independent thinking and innovation that allowed the United States to pull ahead of its state-sponsored adversaries like China and Russia. The only thing America risks losing by embracing alternative ideas is the illusion of control Tyson and his peers cling to. And let's talk about the irony here. Neil decries justifies America's supposed reactivity while failing to identify the real elephant in the room, the decline of critical thinking. The real reason America isn't what it was at the end of the 20th century is because we've let ideological nonsense erode objective reality. The anti-science movement Neil now seems to play for, the one where biology is suddenly subjective and feelings outweigh facts, is a symptom of a deeper problem. It's not just that people disagree on facts, it's that a large swath of society has rejected any notion of objective truth. They believe they can live in a consequence-free world of moral relativism, and America will somehow continue leading that way. That's not progress, that's delusion. And it's a red flag when even the academic and scientific establishments start championing this anti-critical thinking agenda, all while pretending they're the arbiters of truth. Finally, the biggest contradiction of all, Tyson's claim that nature is the ultimate judge, jury, and executioner of what is objectively true. Fine. So let's apply that to his very next comments about trans athletes.
So I did my own study of the relative speed of men relative to women in Olympic sports, the world records, from the 100 meters to the 200 meters, the 400, right on up to the marathon. And what I noticed is in every event, on average, men were 10% faster than women, 10% faster. And in events that require strength, that percent was even higher. I forgot what my exact number, it might have been 50% stronger, okay? So across the board, that is the case. So that's not, there's no dispute there. That's just objective truth.
This feels more like a magician pulling vagueness out of his hat than an astrophysicist making a solid argument. Tyson proudly declares that he conducted his own study, cue the fanfare, on the speed and strength differences between men and women across Olympic sports. But wait, where's the study, Neil? Did I miss the peer-reviewed paper published on Nature or Science? What's the methodology? What data sets did you use? What events did you analyze? Did you control for variables like training access, competition depth, or physiological differences in extreme endurance sports? Crickets. The truth is, Tyson casually invoking a study with zero transparency on methods or results is a rhetorical sleight of hand. It sounds authoritative until you realize it's a fancy way of saying, hey, just trust me, bro. And for a man who demands that others cite their sources and adhere to the same rigors of scientific inquiry, this is hypocrisy on full display. If he's serious about this study, then publish it. Open it up for the public scrutiny. But, of course, he won't, because vague claims allow him to hold on to his conclusions without the inconvenience of anyone challenging them directly. And speaking of challenging conclusions, let's compare Tyson's current conclusions on Piers Morgan to the other whopper he cooked up on his last appearance on Bill Maher, that women have an advantage in long-distance swimming. Well, that one didn't age well, did it? If Tyson's magical study provided the conclusion he stated on Piers Morgan, it makes his claim on Maher even more of a joke. Let's look at the facts. Katie Ledecky, widely considered the greatest female swimmer of all time, holds the world record for the women's 1,500-meter freestyle at 15 minutes, 28 seconds, and 48 tenths. Impressive? Absolutely. But how does it compare to the men? In the same event, Ledecky's time wouldn't crack the top 100 globally. In fact, in 2023 alone, nearly 500 male swimmers posted faster times. So Tyson's insinuation that women hold some mysterious natural advantage in long-distance swimming doesn't just lack evidence, it's directly contradicted by existing data. If Neil had done even a cursory glance at current results, he'd know that. Now let's expand beyond anecdotal performances and bring in broader studies. The physiological differences between men and women in sports are well documented. Men generally possess larger lung capacity, higher hemoglobin levels, greater muscle mass, and longer limbs, all factors that provide significant advantages in speed, strength, and endurance. Studies published in journals like the British Journal of Sports Medicine consistently confirm these disparities. For example, research shows that men on average produce 30 to 40% more muscle power than women and have 10 to 12% faster running speeds in elite competition, a far cry from Tyson's nebulous 50% figure that conveniently he can't recall. What Tyson is doing here is a textbook rhetorical strategy. Toss out big generalized numbers without details, add a dash of objective truth bravado, and hope no one questions it. Neil, You're out here offering pseudoscientific conclusions based on your own mystery study while glossing over hard facts. If America is losing standing, it's not because of people like RFK questioning fast food. It's because too many so-called intellectuals have abandoned critical thinking in favor of ideological appeasement. You can't champion nature as the ultimate judge while selectively ignoring it when it doesn't suit your narrative. And let's not forget Tyson's glaring contradiction. After all this talk about nature being the ultimate arbiter of truth, he shifts gears in his next breath to downplay the scientific reality of biological differences in sports. You can't have it both ways, Neil. Either nature matters or it doesn't. And when it comes to trans athletes, the science is crystal clear. Male puberty confers advantages that cannot be erased by hormones alone. Yet Tyson sidesteps this, muddling the issue with hypotheticals as if reality is too uncomfortable to confront.
So now we have to ask, why do we watch sports at all? Okay? And at Friday Night Lights, that's in the United States, that's high school football. Saturday, it's college football. Sunday, it's the NFL. Do you realize, of course, that the worst team ever in the NFL could wipe its ass with the best team ever in college? Why? Because every single player in the NFL was the best person in their college. And so there's no contest between these zones of athletic engagement. But we still like watching college. We don't watch college and say, the Philadelphia Eagles could whip their ass, so let's not watch it. No, we like the equality of the contest and not knowing who would win. That's what makes sports fun.
Tyson's attempt to equate college football to professional football as some grand metaphor is riddled with logical fallacies, bad analogies, and outright sloppy reasoning. He says the worst NFL team could wipe its ass with the best college team because every single player in the NFL was the best person in their college. Now, that might sound clever, but it falls apart the second you actually think about it. First off, Tyson's argument oversimplifies the relationship between college football and the NFL. He paints a picture as if NFL teams are made up solely of the best college players, as though there's a clean conveyor belt where college stars automatically turn into pros. That's not how it works. The NFL isn't just college's best. It's made up of players who develop the most potential over time. This includes raw talent, work ethic, opportunity, coaching, and yes, even luck. Plenty of the best college athletes fizzle out in the NFL. Just look at the long list of Heisman winners, players considered the best in college, who failed to succeed in the NFL, like Tim Tebow, Johnny Manziel, Jameis Winston. Need an example of the opposite? Let's talk about Tom Brady, the greatest NFL quarterback of all time. In college at Michigan, Brady was far from the star of the team. He sat behind Brian Grease, split time with Drew Henson, and never lit up the stat sheet. Scouts ignored him, calling him too slow and too average, leading to the infamous 199th pick in the NFL draft. He wasn't a phenom. He wasn't the strongest. He wasn't the most hyped. And yet, through resilience, grit, and development, Tom Brady became the GOAT. So no, Neil, NFL players are not automatically the best of college football. They're the players who made the transition and developed over time. The NFL isn't a direct continuation of college greatness. It's a separate tier entirely, a point that undermines Tyson's overly simplistic analogy. Tyson's hasty generalization misses the very reason college football thrives in the first place. People don't tune in because they enjoy watching lesser athletes compete. They watch for the tradition, the loyalty, the rivalries, the raw emotion of amateur competition. College football is a cultural experience, not a stand-in for professional football. That's not remotely comparable to the situation with women's sports, where unfair physical disparities between biological male and female athletes are glaringly obvious. Fans want a fair fight, not a predetermined mismatch. So here's the bottom line. Neil's football analogy is lazy, flawed, and irrelevant. Tom Brady proves that greatness isn't always obvious at the college level, and the development from amateur to pro is nuanced, not automatic. Meanwhile, biology remains an undeniable reality in sports, no matter how Tyson tries to muddy the waters. If he wants to engage in these discussions, he needs better arguments than oversimplified comparisons and flashy metaphors. Until then, his reasoning remains as shaky as a third-string quarterback trying to play in the Super Bowl. And I'm not talking about Tom Brady pre-Drew Bledsoe injury.
So, if there's a wave of trans women who dominate the sport against other women, all those sports will become less interesting based on how we all watch sports. Even the Super Bowl here in the United States, if it's a blowout by halftime, nobody watches the second half.
Right.
We watch it for the equality of the contest. Okay, so
sounds like you agree
all
with
I'm
me
saying is, like you said, wait, I'm almost done. So what I see is sports is on the frontier of how to handle this frontier of people who are trans. It's on the frontier of how to resolve that. And I'm making this up now. Imagine the future of sports does not distinguish sex. It distinguishes and sorts people by hormone ratios. I'm making this up, but imagine that if that were the case. That would be interesting. You get a hormone test, you're in this range, and then you compete against other people with the same range of hormones.
That's ridiculous.
That's
Neil, that is ridiculous.
No, it's not. I'll tell you why it's not ridiculous.
You're going to give every single person in sport a hormone test.
Hold on. I used to wrestle. And wrestling, there are people who weigh, sorry, am I using pounds here, 125 pounds, right on up to 240 pounds. They don't wrestle each other. The entire sport separates people so that the contest is interesting.
Yeah.
And so the people of the same weight wrestle each other, and that is the contest.
But if Floyd Mayweather,
I don't know if that's how it will land.
Neil starts off almost conceding the obvious, that people wouldn't have much interest in watching biological women compete against biological men. He rightly points out that we watch sports for the equality of the contest, and that mismatches, like a Super Bowl blowout, are inherently boring. For a second, it feels like we're headed towards some clarity, but then, in classic Tyson fashion, he pivots into an absurd hypothetical about sorting athletes by hormone levels. Neil, I'm begging you. What are you talking about? You admit that fairness and competitive equality are central to why we enjoy sports, but then you twist yourself into a pretzel to propose some dystopian hormone-based league system. Here's a problem. It's a logical fallacy. Specifically, this is a non sequitur, where the conclusion has absolutely no connection to the premise. You've admitted that mismatched competition kills viewer interests. So why would inventing a nonsensical hormone test, something no one has called for and no athlete would support, resolve anything? The point isn't hormone ratios, it's biology. Male puberty permanently confers physical advantages, greater muscle mass, bone density, lung capacity, and hemoglobin levels that no hormone suppression can fully reverse. But let's break this down. Neil tries to justify his hypothetical by pointing to weight classes in wrestling as though it's a parallel to hormone sorting. This comparison falls apart immediately because weight classes exist to ensure fairness between competitors who share the same biological sex. In combat sports like wrestling, boxing, or MMA, larger opponents can give and absorb significantly more damage. So separating by weight ensures a competition remains fair and safe. Similarly, we have age categories in youth sports for the exact same reason, to create fair contests between individuals at comparable stages of physical development. You don't see 17-year-old football players lining up against 12-year-olds, do you? Because no one wants to watch an inherently unfair competition. But here's a kicker. These systems, weight classes, and age groups exist within the male and female categories. You don't see male wrestlers with a certain weight fighting women in the same weight range because biology still matters. Men, even at identical weights, are stronger, faster, and more explosive. There's no hormone test, Neil, that erases the physiological advantages conferred by male puberty. And to even suggest that sorting athletes by hormones would make sports more interesting is not just absurd, it's insulting to athletes who compete under already proven systems of fairness. And once again, what Neil is doing here is a classic rhetorical sleight of hand. He knows he can't win the argument on facts, so he pivots to an imaginary scenario. By saying, I'm making this up, he builds himself a convenient escape hatch. If his idea sounds ridiculous, and it does, he can just claim there was a thought experiment. But this isn't just some harmless hypothetical, it's a distraction, a way to avoid addressing the reality that allowing biological males to compete in women's sports destroys the fairness and equality we claim to value. Now let's go back to Neil's original point. People lose interest in sports when the competition becomes unfair. That's the core issue here, and Neil knows it. His bizarre hormone league fantasy doesn't solve the problem, it highlights it. We already have systems in place to ensure fairness, male and female categories. Within those categories, we further sort by weight, age, and even skill level where appropriate. And guess what? It works. Fans get competitive, fair, and entertaining contests, and athletes compete knowing they have a shot at success. What doesn't work, what undermines the very concept of fair play, is introducing individuals with insurmountable biological advantages into competitions they don't belong in.
I'm telling you that it's the scientific reality, unless you say otherwise, and I don't think you do, because you've already explained that men have a superior speed of power.
I'm not saying otherwise. I started this.
The science is clear to me.
I started this by saying it.
But the science is clear, isn't it?
And I'm saying the solution isn't clear, even if the science is. And so that's all. We can debate what could work. I think the world has to figure it out, and maybe they'll figure it out one day. And maybe it is hormone ratios. I don't know. But if it is hormone ratios and we don't compete sexes, we compete by hormones, that's a whole other interesting future of athletics. By the way, every Olympics, I pause and think to myself, which of these events can and should not be separated by sex?
Which
there
ones?
are some already that are
ones?
the case. And the equestrian. The equestrian does not separate men from
Equestrian
women.
and shooting, I think, also is another one where if they're sitting and shooting, there's no
That
reason.
I didn't know. Yeah. So I just figured there's some that would be the case. We can start there and just work our way up. So yeah, it's a frontier. People are thinking about it.
Tyson has pulled off quite the trick, simultaneously removing himself from the conversation while still taking a position that defies biology. Tyson starts off strong, acknowledging the clear evidence that men have physical advantages over women, a fact so obvious it doesn't need explaining, but then he pulls the ultimate backpedal, shrugging and mumbling that the solution isn't clear and tossing out hypothetical nonsense about hormone ratios. Let me be blunt for a second. This is cowardice disguised as open-mindedness. Neil knows the science. He said the science is clear. Yet instead of sticking to that, he decides to meander into hypothetical territories no one's asking for, where we suddenly sort athletes by hormone tests as though that erases the advantages conferred by male puberty. And here's a real kicker. After years of confidently lecturing the world on objective truth, Neil now punts the issue like it's not his problem. I think the world has to figure it out, he says. Really, Neil? You spent decades explaining black holes and quantum physics, but this basic biological fact is suddenly beyond your ability to explain. It's almost as though he's afraid to say what we all know because he's worried about offending the political orthodoxy he's clearly aligned himself with. That's the real story here. Political ideology. Tyson's not allowed to say certain things because of where he sits on the ideological spectrum. The left has drawn their lines in the sand on this issue, and if you step out of place, they'll eat you alive. So instead of risking his reputation among the ex-activists and ideological enforcers, Tyson retreats into vagueness. He tosses out phrases like the next frontier to make it sound progressive, exciting, an open debate. But let's not kid ourselves. This isn't science. It's political pandering. And for someone who's staked his entire career on being the voice of reason, it's honestly baffling that he's decided to gamble his entire scientific credibility on an issue with nothing to win. What does Neil get from this? Respect from the woke crowd that will turn on him the moment he says the wrong thing? It's a strange hill to die on. Now let's talk about Tyson's absurd suggestion that sports like equestrian and shooting prove mixed gender competition is viable. I can't believe this needs to be said, but sitting on a horse or pulling a trigger isn't remotely comparable to running, swimming, or competing in contact sports. In equestrian events, the horse is the athlete. The physical demands on the rider, while significant, don't compare to competitions where biological differences determine outcomes. And even then, let's be real, equestrian sports are niche events that don't rely on speed, strength, or endurance. The same goes for shooting. Precision shooting involves minimal physical disparity between men and women because it's a skill-based sport, not a test of athleticism. To use these outliers as examples of why other sports should ignore biological realities is lazy reasoning and frankly disingenuous. And Neil, if you're so fascinated by sports that shouldn't be separated by sex, let me throw you a challenge. Name a single major athletic event where biological women regularly outperform biological men. I'll wait. Because despite all of the technological advantages, coaching improvements, and training methods available today, that event doesn't exist. Why? Because biology matters. It's why we separate sports into male and female categories in the first place, to ensure fairness. And within those categories, we already have additional sorting mechanisms like weight classes in combat sports or age groups in youth competitions. These systems exist for a reason, to create a fair contest. No one's arguing to eliminate weight classes in wrestling or MMA because a 125-pound fighter would get obliterated by a 240-pound opponent. Why? Because fairness matters. Competition is only compelling when the playing field is level. Neil acknowledges this himself. So it's even more perplexing why he insists on twisting himself into a pretzel to maintain his original point. So Tyson's attempt to use fringe sports as a justification falls flat, and his refusal to take a definitive stance is even worse. He admits the science, but refuses to follow through on its implications because he's more interested in protecting his ideological credibility than defending objective truth. The man who once told us to follow the evidence is now content to avoid it when it becomes politically inconvenient. Instead, he hides behind empty phrases like, "it's the next frontier," as though that absolves him of responsibility. Here's the bottom line. This issue isn't complicated. The science is clear. Fair competition matters. And Tyson, who built his career on explaining the obvious, is now deliberately obfuscating to avoid upsetting the wrong people. That's not scientific inquiry. That's capitulation. And for someone who prides himself on being a man of reason, it's an embarrassing spectacle to watch. Anyway, you tell me what you think in the comments down below. Have a terrific day. Peace.